This story begins with two young women who decided to dedicate their time and their energy towards creating a new vision for a public park. This story ends with taking that idea and attempting to actually help restore some of the ecology of the New York Harbor. My name is Jay Velgora, and I'm the founder of Studio V Architecture based in New York City. The story begins here with two young women named Karen Zabarski and Stacy Anderson. I met them at a conference just like this, where I was presenting on creating greater equity on the waterfront in New York City with our projects, which are heavily involved in the waterfront, including building housing, affordable housing, schools, and parks. I met them in the green room where they were presenting a project of their own. They were in their 20s, and they had this idea that they wanted to take this area on the waterfront in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, a very interesting, dynamic, constantly changing neighborhood. And this area was designated for a park, but it hadn't happened. It had run into some challenges, and it was also filled with these 10 massive structures, former oil tanks, that were empty and decommissioned. And they had a new vision for it. Karen and Stacy decided that they wanted to create a new kind of park where they wouldn't wipe this clean, but they would actually tie in the history of Brooklyn to create something that would be very special, a new kind of open space for the waterfront. So when I met with them, I said, I think you really need a design. I think you really need some kind of a vision if you want to take this forward, and we'd like to help. So we offered our services pro bono to them, but we also went out to all of our friends that we do normal projects with. We went to the lawyers, the graphic designers, the structural engineers, the lighting designers, the environmental scientists, and we asked each of them if they would donate their time pro bono for the project, which became known as the Tanks and also Maker Park. And every single person that we asked, without fail, agreed. And so we've dedicated our time to make this project, hopefully, not just a future project, but a reality. The first thing we did was climb into the site. We had to break into the site and climb over the fences, all of these professionals clambering over the property, and we discovered this beautiful, overgrown kind of wilderness in the heart of New York City in Brooklyn. But when we did some further research, we discovered that there were some interesting stories to the past, too. If you look on the left, it was not only the Standard Oil Works and the Bayside Oil Works, but it originally began with Pratt's Astral Oil. I love the kind of logo that says, "Doesn't explode." And Charles Pratt, who was the man who founded this, was an early utopian industrialist. He was actually very well known for creating social housing for his workers. He was very unusual. And while he espoused a series of social goals, a man who was far more voracious lusted after this oil works and managed to purchase it from him. His name was John D. Rockefeller. But Charles Pratt took the money from the sale of this site and used it to found the Pratt Institute on the right, which accepted women and people of color, shockingly for the 19th century, an educational institution where people could afford to better themselves. So this site suddenly already had a history in transforming oil into something deeply philanthropic and different that was part of the public life of New York City. Now, this neighborhood also had some challenges. Greenpoint was very interesting and in many ways a very successful neighborhood, but in some ways controversial. It had this wonderful history and character, small, funky shops, and usual kind of neighborhood grain and feel to it, but at the same time, a rezoning, which was very successful, had built new housing, new affordable housing, and access to the waterfront, but it also resulted in these massive glass towers that some felt was taking away the kind of history and character of the neighborhood, even as it supported development that was essential for the city. So we thought, how could we play a role in this? And meanwhile, the neighborhood was promised a park on this site, which didn't happen yet. And so this sign, "Where's Our Park?" shows the community reaching out and asking for something to happen on this site within the heart of the development. Now, when we looked at these oil tanks, we found that they were very beautiful. Each one, there were 10, consisted of an inner and an outer layer, 10 concentric circles with 3 different types. We went to our structural engineer and we said, can we modify these? Can we use them? They were already empty. They were already clean, although there was some pollution in the ground from the former petroleum. So we thought, how could we engage these in a kind of a design exercise and a vision to keep them, but repurpose them for something new? Our structural engineer, Thornton Tomasetti, determined that we could actually create a series of slices within them. They would maintain their structural integrity. We could cut the tops off. And we developed this notion of filling them with soil. We worked with Ken Smith, the well-known landscape architect, and we found that we could create a series of gardens inside them, which would actually help bioremediate the site, but it would also allow us to create 10 unique circular gardens with an inner and an outer layer that could relate to one another. And so our vision was to take a site that looked like this, with these 10 tanks, and this is just a portion of it. If you look in the plan on the larger design, which is even on the screen outside, we also included playgrounds and children's areas and boat launches, but we thought we could take this and transform it into this, a series of each individual unique garden that could be special and change over time, but unified by an overall palette that would surround and connect them with a sequence through the tanks leading up to the edge. So in order to help realize this, Pentagram developed our logo, we developed a website. We decided we had to reach out to the community and we had to work with people in order to try to make this a reality. So we developed a whole series of brainstorming sessions, public meetings. Hundreds of people attended with the idea that we really needed to solicit input, and it wouldn't just be a fixed design, but we would work with the community to incorporate their elements into the design. And even the notion, the formal notion of these 10 circular interconnected gardens suddenly allowed for variation and input. Maybe the design wouldn't be entirely fixed. Maybe we could create a framework that would hold the design together and make it work in the long run, but certain elements of it could change over time. And so we could develop these different components where we could have different gardens, different cultural elements incorporated into it, performance spaces. So we developed each of the different tanks in a different way. The first one you can see here is a grove of trees with wildflowers for having picnics in it. The second one we filled with water and grew vines around the edge in order to capture the reflections of sunlight. The third is an adventure playground, but filled with the works of local artists from the neighborhood. I remember in some of the community meetings, one man came up to me because the project was controversial. And he said, "Why would you want to put children in one of these industrial structures?" And I said, "Sir, do you have children?" And he was horrified. He said, "No." And I said, "I have kids and I've raised them going to public parks in New York City, and they would be the first ones that would want to go inside this tank." So we had to also deal with controversy because some people from the community felt that we should wipe the site clean, that the tanks were a bad memory, that we should remove the industrial past. But the more we worked on the project, hundreds and hundreds of people came out to support it and to suggest that we should do something else. So the story goes further. As we tried to work with the community, we found another group that was interested, and they are called the Billion Oyster Project. This is a group founded by Pete Malinowski in New York City, an incredible group dedicated to teaching children maritime skills, but also taking oysters from the restaurants of New York, the shells, repurposing them and trying to rebuild the oyster reefs in the New York harbor, which was originally one of the most profound oyster habitats in the entire world. So one thing I noticed when I talked to Pete was they had about 10,000 gallons of tanks where they would grow their baby oysters. And I said, well, we have a tank here and it's nearly 1 million gallons. And maybe that would help you in your goal to restore the New York harbor by the year 2030 to get 1 billion oysters where they start to become self-replicating and start to create the reefs and start to protect the city from resiliency. So we said, what if we create a real oyster farm, but we make it a kind of an example and a story where it becomes a public pavilion that tells the story of how we depleted our original habitat of the harbor, how we destroyed one of the most incredible oyster habitats in the world, but also tells the story of how we could work together to recreate that. So we developed this design, which I sort of like to call the Guggenheim of oyster tanks, where we created this completely accessible ramp that would spiral around the tank, allowing a series of portholes where you could look into the interior and see the oysters growing. School children like mine could come here and see this, ending in a platform at the top with incredible views over the skyline of Manhattan. And then finally, the inlet itself is one of the greatest oyster habitats in New York City. The inlet is particularly well suited to growing oysters. They had 35 research stations. One was located here. It was one of the best locations. So we take the baby oysters and we bring them down the waterfall and implant them back into the harbor. This last two views shows the overall aspect of the park, where we would bring together all the different activities. We created a native wetlands surrounding it with a series of mounds of grass with native plantings that would actually act to restore and bioremediate the oil in the ground at a significant savings, which would allow the park to happen quicker. Our environmental report shows that the digging it all out and exposing it to the air would cost about $220 million, but bioremediating in place would cost about $20 million, about 1/10 of the cost. So in summation, we go back to the end where we finished with oysters, but the activists bring us back to the beginning. We're working now to make this vision a reality. We're working with community groups to try to make this happen, despite the fact that some people are afraid of the idea of keeping the tanks. And we think that architecture can actually act in a larger way. working with others, graphic designers, scientists, landscape architects, ecologists, can we work together to create projects that perhaps rethink the way we do our cities, restore our habitats, protect them and make them more resilient? Can we perhaps come up with a new kind of park where we can play a role with others to help achieve that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just want to have a little bit of sense of scale. What is the size or the section of these different...
There are 3 different size tanks.
yeah?
They range in size. If I go to maybe some of the earlier diagrams here. So this perhaps gives you a sense of the scale.
This is one of the biggest ones.
Yes, so we chose one of the 3 largest ones. They tend to be somewhat similar in height. So the overall height tends to be about 60 feet, and the overall diameter to the outermost component is also close to about 70 feet. So that gives you a little bit of a sense. They're about 6 stories tall.
And another very pragmatic question, who's the owner?
The owner is the city of New York.
It's the city of New York.
And so the city is looking really to create a vision for this and hasn't decided yet how to design the park. So in the course of our doing the design, the city finally completed the acquisition of the site, and now they own it, but they have not yet decided on the design of the park.
And do they listen to you?
They listen to us, and they are looking to try to find a way of consensus, though, because the city is always afraid of anything that is controversial. And so for us, it has been helpful to publicize the project, to take it out. We've created a website, savethetanks.org, and really to get the message out, which helps us in order to really build support in order to realize this vision.
And is there, I love the project, but is there more people competing about this, or are you the only one? I have no idea how it's...
The city hasn't released a design for this site yet, so there is no competition, but there is controversy within the community. And again, I must be fair about that. We found that many of the younger people and the creative people within the neighborhood love the idea and actually support it probably in far larger numbers. As a friend of mine who runs the community relations, and we do a lot of work with community relations, has told me, oftentimes the people leading the political organizations are an older guard. And some of them feel that they've waited a long time for the park and they want nothing more than to tear the tanks down, and they feel that replacing it with just plain grass or open space would be better.
That would be a pity. Thank you.
And following on from Francine, are any rival groups with other sort of community-focused designs that are proposing something different?
No, there aren't so far.
That's a very interesting project. Yeah. The when you were saying the bioremediation is 20 million versus 220, in the end it still ends up with the exactly the same result, does it, in terms of the safety?
Yes, and even this is interesting. It's controversial. So in order to tear everything out, if you will, it's called a dig and haul operation, which is a traditional method of bioremediation. They actually tear out all of the soil, dig it down to the level. By the way, the level of pollution here is not particularly high. Petroleum products, as compared to other elements, PCBs and heavy metals, are far more benign. Moreover, they're not really moving within the site. Usually it's more of a problem if they move. In this case, we've adopted the strategy, as you can see the inlet, which is one of the rare few inlets left in New York City. Working with Ken, we developed an entire planting palette. It's called the Bushwick Inlet. There are 7 inlets left.
Is this one?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the inlet is a natural feature. It used to be a massive natural wetland. And so we've decided to restore it as a series of dunes and grasses, investigating the original native plantings from this area. And then by capping it, instead of digging the soil out, trucking it through the neighborhood, which would take 20,000 truckloads, and then burning it, which is how they actually remove soil, which of course releases the carbon into the air. We would encapsulate it, inject the soil with bacteria, and over time it would remediate in place, which is completely safe. And it's a far more sustainable method of remediation, and it's much less expensive.
And the oysters won't be polluted by the oil?
So the oysters, very interestingly, as Pete has done them, Pete Malinowski, who founded the Billion Oyster Project, the oysters are actually incredible agents for cleaning the waterfront. Every single oyster will filter 26 gallons of water every day. When the New York harbor was originally full of oysters, that meant that they would filter the entire body of water of the harbor every 2 days. So by getting 1 billion of them in place, they would actually serve to clean the water, and moreover, the oysters that we've chosen are not edible, the ones that Pete grows. They actually taste terrible because they don't want to encourage people to eat them until the water is remediated. So they're a very robust variety that are very good at cleaning the water, but they're not for human consumption.
Like toxic, toxic superheroes.
Yeah. And I mean, you're the sort of guy, I'd never met you before, but you're the sort of guy who's canoeing upstream when everybody else is canoeing downstream. And, you know, I was sort of thinking about you as you talked, and you may be an architect, but you're essentially a professional guerrilla, aren't you? And you've mobilized everybody else. And then you've legitimized the process through the charrette. And now you're going to get this project over the line, we all hope. How will you design, because there's no limit to where you work, how are you going to design a management process that can survive you and will be sustainable off into the future? Because this is going to need some precious nurturing.
Well, there are a series of organizations in New York, and of course there is an example like the Friends of the High Line, where they create a public organization in order to maintain a structure. And so we've had a tremendous amount of help and outreach from other people that have founded nonprofits. There's also the Pratt Center, which was originally, and this would, of course, they haven't agreed to it yet, but the Pratt Center is a community organization that is parallel to and separate from the Institute. So part of our hope would be, because of their legacy with the site, to involve them in assisting us, because it matches some of their goals too.
Thanks. It's a wonderful project, and it's really great to see advocacy at this level. I'm just intrigued by the whole idea around memory and architecture, because I think that for me is where the architecture lies in this. So what is your approach to the memory of the oil tanks?
Well, you bring something very special to mind for me. The very reason I became an architect, my father worked in the steel mills of Buffalo. My mother was an English teacher. My father used to take me into these massive industrial structures a mile long. You could see the curvature of the earth in them, I felt, when I was little. And they had a tremendous inspiration for me. So I believe that keeping these industrial structures, finding new uses. I saw the steel mills where my father worked torn down. Now we're working to rebuild the grain elevators of Buffalo, which is another project we're just working on. So to me, these industrial artifacts that were not meant for human habitation have a tremendous role in the history and culture of our city, and finding ways to take things from before that actually really polluted or destroyed our environment and using them to restore and recreate our environment, I think is the greatest possible use we could find for them.
Okay,
Thank
sorry,
you.
I'm asking a slightly different question. In your images, they're all white. They all look perfect. What is it about the past and the memory that you're keeping?
I guess in this case, we're keeping the forms, but in some of them too, and you can see here how we've incorporated on some of the ones on the foreground, artwork and so forth, because people did graffiti them and make them into their own forms of art. I'd like to preserve a component of that too. The tanks were originally white, so that's bringing them back to their original history and then contrasting them with the greenery. But from a formal basis, we did debate this, and the idea of incorporating artwork and having community artists and graffiti artists also cover them, as we also showed in the other example with the children's playground, we think is also an element of the design.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe nice to keep one in its original condition, perhaps. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Great presentation. Oh yes, and now to present you with your award.